I'm Justin Singer. I'm in CS 6263 in the summer 2019 session, and I'm going to be discussing leveraging USB to establish host identity using commodity devices. The original paper was authored by Adam Bates, Ryan Leonard, Hannah Pruce, Daniel Loud, and Kevin R.B. Butler at the University of Oregon. On this slide, there's a link to the original paper. I'm going to be discussing an overview of what the paper discusses, the problem it presents, the solution it proposes, the results, the limitations of that solution, and recommendations for how this can be used. The focus of this paper was identifying a system uniquely. This is an important goal because within networks, we want to make sure that the hosts on that network are the hosts we expect them to be. It's important for trust across connections to make sure that if we're communicating with a computer over a network, it's the computer that we expect, and for forensics investigators to track down attackers' machines or make sure that the machines they're investigating are the machines that they expect. The problem with identifying a host uniquely is that it's very difficult. In an attack scenario, attackers can pretend to be the trusted host. They can spoof MAC addresses, serial numbers, hardware specifications, and pretend to be a host through software or through the network connection. Even if acting with a trusted host, those hosts can be acting as proxies to an attacker's computer. This is known as the cuckoo attack because the cuckoo bird lays its eggs in other birds' nests and has those other birds incubate them for it. This is very similar to having a good host relay messages to an attacker and having it forward the messages that the attacker sends back. Machines may also have identical hardware and operating system running on them. This can make it very difficult to differentiate between them if you can't trust a serial number. The solution that's proposed is that through USB, computers can be identified based on hardware, firmware, and software stacks. This can be accomplished with commodity hardware, in this case, an Android device. A solution like this is easy to use, since you can just plug in a phone to a computer and launch an app. And it works on any machine with USB. It doesn't have to be specialized hardware. The Android app that was developed for this research looks like the screen grabs to the right. You specify the make, model, OS, and other information about a machine, and it's able to understand just from the USB connection whether it's the host you expect or not. Past solutions to this problem have suffered for a number of reasons. USB forensics in the past required an expensive USB analyzer. This was very specialized hardware that was difficult to get and cost thousands and thousands of dollars. There have also been previous proposals for similar solutions of identifying hosts based on USB connection. However, they assumed that the host was cooperative and was giving benign inputs. This paper proposes a method of identifying hosts, even if they're acting maliciously, or sending spoofed or malicious inputs to the USB. The implementation of this solution relies on machine learning. A model was built using a random forest classifier that was able to take USB signals based on a number of inputs and classify what machine it identified them as. Some example of the inputs that the model used were operating system, hardware attributes, the messages sent across USB, and the precise timing of messages. To explain a little bit more about a random forest, since this is the classifier used in solving this problem, we have the following diagram. First, let's describe decision trees. A decision tree represents a number of inputs, where at each level of the tree, it splits at a certain input. For instance, say you had one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish. The first split may be on red or blue, and then the second split down the tree would be on 1 or 2. With this simple decision tree, and given those inputs, you'd be able to identify and classify fish from Dr. Seuss's famous book. In Dr. Seuss's own words, 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish, black fish, blue fish, old fish, new fish. This one has a little star. This one has a little car. Say, what a lot of fish there are. Yes, some are red, and some are blue. Some are old, and some are new. Some are sad, and some are glad, and some are very, very bad. Why are they sad and glad and bad? I do not know. Go ask your dad. Some are thin, and some are fat. The fat one has a yellow hat. From there to here, from here to there, funny things are everywhere. Here are some who like to run. They run for fun in the hot, hot sun. Oh me, oh my, oh me, oh my, what a lot of funny things go by. Some have 2 feet, and some have 4. Some have 6 feet, and some have more. Where do they come from? I can't say, but I bet they have come a long, long way. We see them come, we see them go. Some are fast, and some are slow. Some are high, and some are low. Not one of them is like another. Don't ask us why. Go ask your mother. Say, look at his fingers. 1, 2, 3. How many fingers do I see? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He has 11. 11. This is something new. I wish I had 11 too. At first listen, this may sound like a simple children's story, but there are a lot of parallels to random forest learning. For instance, Dr. Seuss mentions many attributes which may be fed into a model. Age is one that comes about very early in the story, when he mentions the old fish and the new fish. That could be a node upon which we split in a decision tree. Another example of an attribute is one that has a little star and one that has a little car. Whether or not an input has a star or not could be a split in a decision tree. as could be if one has a little car. Now, we don't know how these attributes could be used to uniquely identify a specific fish, or how rare they potentially are. But by making many decision trees, randomly splitting on these attributes, and then assembling them in a way that continually improves the output, we can build an ensemble learner that takes the most effective trees and has them vote in a way that makes them more effective than any individual tree could be. The way these trees are normally constructed is by having the feature that most differentiates the data, that most correlates to the classification of outputs as the first split. However, this isn't how we use them in a random forest. In a random forest, instead, decision trees are split based on random attributes, and many of these decision trees with random splits are made. We then use a technique called bagging, or bootstrap aggregating, with replacement to build our forest of decision trees. This means that we'll take a random sampling of decision trees with replacement, meaning that a specific decision tree can be picked twice or more times, and build an ensemble of them. We then feed the input to each decision tree, and each decision tree gives its own classification, and those classifications are treated as votes. Notice this diagram describes majority voting from the outputs of the decision tree. The final classifier is whichever class has the majority of votes. We iterate when training this model by choosing models, or choosing decision trees rather, that most often give the correct classification. And therefore, by building a forest of these randomly generated decision trees, and then improving our forest through various iterations, we can get a much more accurate representation of the combination of inputs than we would with a single tree. This is an example of an ensemble learning device, or an ensemble machine learner, which uses multiple structures or models to generate one output from one input. Some of the inputs that were used to build this model and to classify hosts are shown here. There are different inputs such as USB calls, get descriptor for the serial number of the computer, for the language the computer is using, the manufacturer, the number of idle IRQs, the inter-IRQ gap, the length of enumeration, and other attributes as well. All attributes of the USB protocol, and that you can glean simply from plugging in a USB device. And notice from these graphs that hosts running different operating systems time these messages very differently. For instance, in the top left, we see get descriptor for the serial number. The response on Windows 7 comes much more rapidly than in OS X. In Linux, it comes at a very similar time, but for instance, if you look at the top right, the average inter-IRQ gap, Linux and Windows 7 are very separated in terms of timing. By combining these different inputs, one could see how a machine learning model could very easily separate the operating system a host is running, based simply on the timing of these USB calls. The results of the study were as follows. of a test group of 30 machines with identical hardware and operating systems, each could be identified with 70% accuracy. Considering that the separation we saw in the previous slide was comparing different operating systems, getting such accuracy on hosts running the same hardware and the same operating system is actually very impressive. And in the real world, most hosts would not be exactly the same. With differing hosts, within tenths of a second of gathering data, the model was able to differentiate machines with upwards of 90% accuracy. Also, another finding was that a hypervisor running on a host could be detected with 100% accuracy. The benefits of a solution of identifying hosts through USB using commodity hardware are that it's easy to use. You simply need an Android app running on an Android phone, plugged into the USB port of a computer. It works using commodity hardware, meaning that you could use old recycled Android devices for very nearly no money. It works on any host with a USB port. This doesn't just include typical personal computers or servers. It also includes embedded hardware as well. It can't be spoofed remotely. Remote attackers have no opportunity to fool this system because we're connecting straight through USB to the hardware. It works with systems not on the internet, aka sneaker nets. So for instance, if you were using an industrial system with a closed control loop, you would still be able to accurately identify the hosts in that system and make sure that no one had replaced the hardware without you knowing. This is robust against active attacks, such as malicious inputs, meaning that if a host is running a virus and giving malicious USB signals, it has no effect on the output of this model. And it's able to accurately differentiate based on the model of hardware, the operating system running on the host, and the software stack. The limitations of this solution are as follows. Physical access to the machine is required. Because this is a connection through USB, there isn't any way to do this classification remotely. You need to physically access the USB port of a device. It's not the most accurate solution when trying to identify hosts with identical hardware and operating systems. 70% accuracy is impressive considering how this method works, but in the real world there may be a situation where a company is using many hosts running identical operating systems and hardware and would need more accuracy in identifying a specific host. The machine learning model may not work as well on untested configurations of hardware and software. For example, for operating systems or hardware configurations that the model was not originally trained on, it would have no way of classifying those and would potentially struggle to differentiate them from each other or from configurations that it was trained on. Recommendations. This could be a good way to check hardware in an industrial setting. Whether or not the hardware in an industrial setting is connected to the greater internet, this will work, and this will make sure that the hosts are what you expect. It also works with embedded devices and low-cost hardware that might be put to work in an industrial setting. Because of inaccuracy with identical hosts, this should not, however, be the only method used to determine a host's identity in settings where many machines are the same, or where running common machine configurations, or we're using a machine configuration that might be available to an attacker. If an attacker knew the exact hardware configuration and operating system running on a machine, they could potentially still fool this method of host identification. Questions? Ask on Piazza. Thank you for watching.